Welcome to Man Up, the podcast by men, about men, and for men who are striving to be better fathers, husbands, leaders, and followers of Jesus. Are you ready? Man up.
Yes, sir!
Welcome, my friends. I'm your host, Jared Bowman, and this is Man Up, your podcast with the encouragement that you need to be a better father, husband, leader, and follower of Jesus. And this week, we are talking about leadership as fathers and husbands. Yes, we're on to week 3 of our 12-week, 12-question challenge, and we are right in the thick of things now. This is where things start getting really introspective because we're asking the question, am I the example that I want my family to follow? As a man, am I presenting the characteristics that I really think that my family should walk in? I want my sons to grow up like this. I want my daughters to grow up and marry men like this. I want my wife to see me in the way that I'm presenting myself as the kind of husband, father, and leader that I am showing to the world. This is such a big question, because the definition of masculinity is so in flux today that oftentimes this is where the outside voices start to creep in, that they really start to change the notion of men as leaders, as husbands as leaders, as fathers as leaders. And when those notions change, the whole thing starts crumbling. And so what we're going to do today is, number one, we're going to talk about why this is really so important. We're going to talk about what we're charged to do as leaders. And then I'm going to share a quick presentation with you on some different principles I've learned from various books that I've read, not necessarily the Bible, but some other books that I've read on leadership that I think can help us as fathers. If you guys don't know me, I am a voracious reader. I love to read. I love to read my Bible. I love to read fiction. I love to read nonfiction, particularly books that help me be a better husband, father, leader. Hence the program. And so I want to share some things with you that I've learned from outside the Bible that I think will help us as fathers. But one of these principles we're going to start with, I'm going to tell you why it's important in a little while. But the principle that I want to start with is, why are fathers so important? Why is it so important that I embody the kind of leadership as a husband and a father that I want my family to imitate in some sort of way? Let me share a couple of thoughts with you. In Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4, the Apostle Paul wrote, "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord." When Paul's giving this same instruction over in the book of Colossians chapter 3, he words it a little bit differently. He says, "Husbands, love your wives and do not be embittered against them. Children, be obedient to your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing to the Lord. Fathers, do not exasperate your children so that they will not lose heart." That idea of exasperation is to stir them up to exhaustion, stir them up to anger. It's really the same thought that we see in verse 19, where husbands are to love their wives and not be embittered against them. That what we bring to the family, and we said this back in the week that led up, the introductory week before week 1, that fathers are directly responsible. We are the biggest influence, according to the statistics that we shared that week, on the tone and the temperament of our families. The father has more say in whether or not our children continue in faith. The father has more say than anything in whether or not his children grow up to be functioning members of society. The father has a bigger influence on the overall temperament of his household than any other factor. And yet, too often, what happens is we ignore the role that leadership and leading by example plays in setting that tone and setting that temperament. So as we're thinking about this, I'm thinking about the week 3 questions, and we had all of those questions in there about the kind of character that you wanted your kids to have, the characteristics of the family dynamic that you wanted to have. And then I asked you to rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10, that how well do you exemplify those characteristics that you want your family to have? And really what we're talking about, what this all comes down to, that we're going to talk about in just a moment when we get into the presentation, is we're talking about leadership styles. How well do I function as a leader in my family? Is that something that you even think about? When I think about my role in the family, do I think about leadership? Do I think about headship? What does that mean? Does it mean that I'm providing stability? Does that mean that I am providing direction? Does that mean that I'm just providing financially? For a lot of people, leadership means different things. I told you last week we were talking about fatherhood. I'm in several Facebook groups that are meant to help men be better husbands and fathers, and trying to provide, because I've been a preacher for 25 years, trying to provide some godly advice in those environments among a lot of ungodly advice. And I've been dealing with a couple of guys recently who have just been saying, I feel like I've been phoning it in, that things are so stressful, things are so bad in the world around me, things are so against me that I feel like all I can do is show up, go to work, make the money, bring it home, and I am spent. That they're not actively involved with their wife, focusing on that communication, trust, and intimacy that we talked about on the first challenge week. They're not actively involved in the lives of their children like we talked about last week. And yet they know it's a problem, but because they don't see themselves as leaders, because life just happens to them, rather than saying, okay, here's the direction I'm going to go, here's the response that I'm looking for, because life just happens to them and they don't see themselves as leaders, then what ends up happening is there's a vacuum in leadership. There's no one thinking about the tone or the temperament of the family. And these men will tell you, I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to affect the mood of the other people in the house. I don't know how to change the environment around me. And we've become these victims of circumstance. And one of the reasons why, and this is why if you checked your email, you're part of the 12-week challenge. If you're not, you can still sign up. There's a link for it in the description, along with some Amazon links for some books you might want to check out on leadership. They're more business oriented. I've got some fatherhood books that I'm going to put up next week. But no, next week is conflict resolution. I've really got some books put up on that one. But these are more business oriented. They're applying business principles to leadership, because leadership is honestly leadership. There are specific things that God wants us to lead in. He wants us to bring our children up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. He wants us to teach our children the fear of the Lord. He wants us to be an instructive influence in our children's lives. I get that. But fundamentally, leadership is leadership. But most of us, and this is where I was going with that email thing, most of us don't know what kind of leaders we are. We naturally gravitate toward a specific leadership style, and we're going to talk about those styles. There's 6 of them. There's more than 6 of them, but there's 6 key ones that all the others are some combination of these 6. And it really starts with this, and this is your fundamental lesson in leadership, just like everything else that we're going to talk about in this 12-week challenge. First, we've got to stop and think about communication, trust, and intimacy. And I say this every week. I will say this every week until it becomes germane to that week again. But intimacy is not strictly talking about the sexual relationship. We're talking about emotional intimacy. We're talking about spiritual intimacy. We're talking about intellectual intimacy. We're also talking about sexual intimacy when we're talking about our wives. Now, I'm going to drop this for you guys right now. There is a bonus episode of this podcast. It's going to show up on Monday or Tuesday next week. Brian and I have already recorded it, but it's going to show up on Monday or Tuesday of next week, that specifically deals with the question, are you getting this? How do I save my marriage? What if I feel like I've married the wrong person? What do I do to try to save the marriage? How do I get back to a place where I'm good? Because most men, and honestly, most women, feel that at some point in their marriage. We're going to talk about that. But communication, trust, and intimacy show up there too. But the key lessons in leadership, the key lessons in life, when you're talking about those interpersonal communications, you're having interpersonal conversations, meaning you're communicating not on a surface level, not on an informational level. You're communicating on a level where you're trying to draw and hold people together. Communication, trust, and intimacy are key to that. And when you're focusing on leadership, communication and trust are really the two that we need to be thinking about a lot. That what am I putting out there? And this isn't just what am I saying, but how am I saying it? And then what am I showing as an example? Am I a leader who leads by example? Am I doing the things that I want those who are following me to do? We don't ever want to be like those people that Jesus talked about in Matthew 23 that says that, do as they say, but not as they do. That's not the kind of leaders we want to be. I know not all of you are coming at this from a biblical perspective, but I do. And I hope that you'll use those principles at least. But the whole idea of do as they say, but don't do as they do, that's never the kind of leader that you want to follow. In fact, he contrasts that later in a different chapter of the Bible over in John chapter 10 with the statement that he's the good shepherd. The key to shepherding, the key to that is being a servant. A shepherd walks out in front of his sheep. He accepts all the danger for them. He chooses the path that they're going to go on, but he chooses it based on their need. And we're going to get to that in just a moment. But as we're thinking about this, I was reading a book by John Maxwell the other day. It's called The 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership. I don't recommend everything John Maxwell writes, but this was actually some really good stuff. And there were 6 of these principles, and really probably some from all 21 of them. But there were 6 of these principles that really jumped out at me when I was thinking about fatherhood and being a husband that leads. The first was the law of influence, that leadership is not about the title. In so much Western culture, leadership is about the title. It's about, we're like the apostles sometimes. We want to fight about who's the greatest. Husbands and wives, when they're following the secular world, there's always this fight over who has control, who's got the title of leader, who wears the pants in the family. Influential leaders lead by influence. They don't worry about the title or the position, but about one life influencing another. I love it that my son calls me daddy. It's my favorite name since he was born, since he learned to speak. But I feel like I need to get up and earn that title every day. Do you feel that way? Do you feel like you need to get up and earn the way that your child looks at you? Do you feel like, hopefully, if you've got a good enough relationship with your wife, that you need to get up and earn the way that she looks at you because you want to leave a positive influence on their life? How about the law of connection, that leaders are touching the heart before they ask for a hand? That we have built trust, there is intimacy between us, there is connection between us. Before I ask you for help or before I offer you help, I am going to build a relationship with you. And this is one of the things that Kenny Embry talks about on his Balancing the Christian Life podcast, that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Am I making those connections? Am I leading in a way that is empowering? That's one of the things that Brian and I talked about in that podcast. It's going to drop next week. It's not one of the official 12, but it's a bonus episode, if you will. But when you look at the worthy woman of Proverbs, the woman that we laid out for our young ladies, it's what you need to be like. What we're doing is we're not just saying this is what you need to be like. We're showing them you need to find a man that respects this. And we said the same thing for Job 31. Job lays out these characteristics of his righteousness. And here's the kind of man that I am. And Brian says, I told my son, be a Job 31 man. And I told my daughter, be a Proverbs 31 woman. And then when we were talking about this, what we realized is what we also need to be teaching is to our young men, you need to find a Proverbs 31 woman that's looking for a Job 31 man, and vice versa. Because ultimately, what each of those do is they empower the other to be the best that they can be. That when I'm secure, I don't get up in the morning and worry about, I'm going to have to fight Lauren for leadership of my household. Because I'm secure in my leadership, because I'm secure in the things that I do as a man, I have no problem with her taking control and making decisions and doing things without running them by me. If it's a giant thing, then hopefully we've got the respect for one another to include each other in those decisions. But I don't let the fact that she's exercising control over some part of our life affect my self-worth and my self-confidence, because leadership is not really about me. It's about the people that I'm leading, whether I'm talking about husbands or fathers or business or whatever. Then a leader and his potential, and this was one that was really eye-opening to me, is defined by those closest to him. Who we're around, the influences that we pour into ourselves as leaders, the tribe of men that we surround ourselves with, those voices, a leader's only going to rise up to that potential. And let me show you what I mean. Have you ever noticed when you're around people that complain, you tend to complain more? Have you ever noticed that when you're around negative people, you tend to be more negative? But have you ever realized also that when you're around people that are joyful, you feel a little bit happier. You feel a little bit more joyful, a little more positive in your outlook. The reason why is the people around us, in a lot of ways, define us. And if we're around people and surrounding people who are limiting our potential of our leadership, that they look at themselves as victims of culture, they look at themselves as waging war against a culture that has abandoned them, that's what we're going to reflect. So we need to choose our influences carefully. There's also the law of the model, that people do what people see. And I love this one, because that's exactly what we're talking about in this third question. Am I modeling for my family what I want them to continue in? And then the law of legacy. A leader's value is measured by succession. That's a fancy way of saying you won't know what you were as a leader until you see the kind of people that your children grow up to be. We all think we're the best leaders, or maybe we all think we're the worst leaders, but the real indication of whether we succeed or fail in leadership is who our children end up becoming. And that law of legacy is so important. And it's really those last two that I want to focus on. One of the things that I really firmly believe is that the most important question you can ask is why. Now, I learned this from a fellow preacher. It's a buddy of mine, passed away last year. His name was Tony Mogg. And he got it from a man named Simon Sinek. You probably know Simon, seen him making the rounds in social media. He wrote a great book called Start With Why. And he talked about how the best organizations on the planet, before they know what their what is or their how is, they know why they're doing what they're doing. Not what we're going to do or how we're going to do it, but why are we doing this to begin with? And I'm going to tell you, this applies to Fortune 500 companies. It applies to small businesses. It applies to individuals, and it applies to families as well. I'm going to suggest to you that why is an important question to ask anytime we're making a decision. Why are we doing this? You go to the refrigerator, you get something out. Why? Is it because I'm hungry, or is it because I'm bored? You seeing the potential behind this? We choose to stay up late, and we know we're going to be punished for it tomorrow. We're going to be tired. We're not going to feel good. Why am I doing this? Is it because I really enjoy this, or is it because I've reached this point of lethargy where I don't actually want to get off the couch anymore? It's funny when you think about it that way, but why is a really important question. For instance, I ask young men when they are contemplating marriage, and I ask this of young ladies too, when they're contemplating marriage, why do you want to get married? The first answer is always, I want to get married. I love this person. Okay, but why? Why? And it's usually some combination of the top three things that you see there: companionship, attraction, sex. But eventually, as you ask this question more and more, as a leader, your why begins to refine. Why am I doing this? Why am I worried about this? Why am I so consumed about this? Why am I not doing this thing? Because ultimately, what they eventually come down to is some kind of answer like, I want to build a life with this person. And you continue this exercise until the question why doesn't make any sense anymore. And then, and only then, have you reached your why. And we as men go through that when we have the conversation about children. Why do you I want to start a family? Why? I'm going to tell you, for a lot of guys, sex is at the top of that list. It's right there in the process. There's going to be more sex. Okay. But why do you want to start a family? It's something my wife needs. Okay. But why do you want to start a family? Is that the end of your why? I want to make my wife happy. Okay, why do you want to start a family? Is that the best why? Is that the last why? Is that really what's resonating with you? I want to be a dad. Why? Eventually, if you get down to it and people are serious about it, then it often becomes something like, I love my wife, and it's part of the journey that defines us. And you get to that level of why, and all of a sudden, you don't have another answer for it. The how and the what begin to define themselves. And here's the thing. Here's why I'm saying this. The clearer your why is, the better the leader you will be. These are interesting examples. Sex is in both of them, so they're fun to talk about. But let's talk about something different that comes up in family life. How about when we know what we're going to do is going to cause tension? We all can admit that there are times when we make decisions that are, we know, we know before the words come out of our mouth that this is going to cause a problem. This is going to precipitate an argument. Well, why are you doing this? Our knee-jerk reaction most of the time is, I'm going to stand on principle. If that's with my wife, if it's with my son, it might be something like, he needs to learn this lesson. Why? Oftentimes, if I think about it a little longer, I go, I was probably lashing out a little bit. If I'm actually starting an argument, one didn't just facilitate itself out of thin air just because of an exchange, but I actually started the argument. I was probably lashing out. Why? At the end of the day, it's probably because I'm not getting my way, which is usually the attention that I want from the other person. Why would you lash out over that? And if I'm being honest with myself, a lot of times, and men, hopefully you'll be honest with yourselves, a lot of times what we're doing is we're self-sabotaging. The fight wasn't really about the thing we fought about. If you'll stop and ask why do you exist? Why are we a family? Why are we doing these things? Not to reason yourself out of it, but to reason yourself deeper into it, to influence your how and your what, you're going to be more effective as a leader. You're going to head off the problems like you see over to the right of the screen, and you're going to be able to achieve those deeper kinds of whys like you see in the first two columns, because ultimately, better whys, this is what they lead to. Why clarifies your task as a leader. When I know why I'm doing what I'm doing, then it begins to make a little more sense. Why helps me know how to communicate the message, because it sets a certain tone and a certain expectation and a certain level of urgent versus not urgent. And why creates trust with those I am leading. If I can share my why with Lauren, she'll never question me. There are times when she questions me, why are you doing that? Well, I don't know. I just want to do it. But why? But if I share my why with her, hey, I think we need to move to Oregon to preach the gospel because there's a church up there who needs a preacher. But why? Why us? Because that's the kind of opportunity I'm looking for. But why us? Because ultimately there's not a lot of people lining up to go to Oregon, and it's a place that I can really evangelize. You know what she said? Okay. But we defined those whys before we made the decision to go. If I had just came into the house and said, hey, babe, there's a congregation in Oregon that's looking for a preacher, let's go. Now, Lauren's always up for an adventure, so she probably would have said, okay. But she wouldn't have been sold on it. She would have been responding to the adventure and not me as a leader, because I can't communicate the vision to her. And we're going to talk about this in a later question. Do I have a vision for my family? But before I can have a vision, I got to have a sense of who I need them to become. And then I've got to ask why I have that sense. And then I've got to ask, am I modeling? Am I putting forward what I want them to become? Because if I've got a why for my son, I want you to be a functioning, honest, productive member of society, then I need to model that same why. That ought to be my why for living and breathing every single day of my life. Why do I expect my son to do daily Bible reading? Because I want him to have a relationship with God. Why? Because I want him to go to heaven. Why? Because I believe that's the best thing for him. Why? Because he's got a soul and I know Jesus died for it. I better be living according to those same principles, because transparency in leadership, that moving away from hypocritical leadership, is so important to building communication, trust, and intimacy. I can communicate what I want him to do. I can communicate what I want Lauren to do. But if I can't show them that it's important to me by living it myself, it's going to be an empty discussion at best. They may follow, but they're not going to share the vision because I'm not living the vision. And this is where leadership styles come in. Now, if you took that leadership quiz and you have your score, none of us are probably purely one type of leader or the other. But if you have those leadership numbers, you're probably some mixture. And I usually say out of the six, you're a mixture of your top two, unless you had three that were really close together. But when it comes to leadership styles, you've got the autocratic leadership. I know this is a little small. They'll be a little bigger on the next slides. Autocratic or authoritarian leadership is characterized by control over all decisions. There's very little input from group members that's accepted. Leaders in this style typically make choices based on their ideas and judgments and rarely accept advice from followers. It's often considered the classical approach where the leader maintains as much power and decision-making authority as possible. I'm going to tell you, some guys are going to gravitate toward this kind of leadership. It's very natural for them. Then there's democratic leadership. Democratic leadership is also known as participative leadership or partner leadership. This involves group participation. This is where everybody gets a vote, right? And in the decision-making process, this type of leadership is going to encourage creativity. That's a good thing. We're going to talk about more pros about that in a minute. But it's also doesn't feel very much like leadership. The best the leader does is he maintains control over the final outcome, but it's not really putting a direction out there. Now, we've all experienced this kind of leadership, right? We've gotten in the car before. Your wife has said she's hungry. I've often said that I'm going to create a restaurant called I Don't Care. It'd be the most profitable business ever, because we get in the car. The wife says she's hungry. She's had a hard day, that nobody feels like cooking. She doesn't want to cook. You don't want to cook. The kids are tired. Okay, let's just go get some dinner. Her idea, you say, okay, babe, what do you want? Well, I don't care. I don't care either. Okay, but I don't care more than you don't care. Okay, what about this? At that moment, my knee jerk is, let me point the car to a restaurant that I want to go to, but we're tired. I'm trying to be sensitive to everybody else's feelings, right? So I say, well, what about a burger? No, I really don't feel like a burger. Okay. Well, what about pizza? Will's in the back seat going, pizza? No, I really don't feel like pizza. Okay. You suggest something. Oh, I don't care. Whatever is good with you. That's what I'm going to call the second chain. Whatever is good with you. Okay. I feel like going to get some tacos. No, I don't know. We had tacos the other day. And eventually, you will have disqualified every restaurant on the list. And then you'll ask her, okay, what do you want? And it's going to be one of two things. It's going to be, I don't know, a burger. Or let's just go home and make a sandwich. It's going to be one of those two things. That's democratic leadership. It's trying to be sensitive to everybody else's wants and needs, but not really always putting it up to a community vote versus really leading. Now, that's important to recognize. That's a legitimate style of leadership. Then there's the laissez-faire leadership, which basically is a hands-off approach. Everybody's going to develop at their own rate. Everybody's going to do their own thing. All authority or power is given to equally divided among the people, and they're going to determine their goals and make decisions and resolve their own problems in their way. Basically, the leader is there only to really call balls and strikes. You've got transformational leadership. These are the guys that have the vision, which we all need to have. We're going to talk about that in one of the upcoming questions. But these are the guys that have the vision for their family. This is where I want my kids to go in 10 years. I want them to go to this college. I want them to have this GPA. I want them to work in this field. I want them to be involved in these teams. I want them to marry this little girl that our family picked out for him when they were infants and they sat beside each other in the church building. We're going to transform their life. Transformational leadership can be good. Transformational leadership are leaders who are never comfortable with the status quo, that they often achieve extraordinary outcomes. They challenge others to develop and grow into what they want them to be. They often encourage creativity among their teams. their families, but they can also have really high expectations. Then you've got the transactional leadership. This is almost straight up carrot and stick leadership. Here's the reward. Here's the punishment. Here's what you get if you do what I want you to do. Here's what you get if you don't. Transactional leaders are motivators. They can be really good at motivating people. Motivation is not always good, but they can be really good at motivating people. They're good at establishing goals, clarifying what those goals mean. It's also got some negatives. It can also bleed away trust and communication and intimacy really quickly. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. And then finally, got the servant leadership. This is the biblical model of leadership. This is the shepherding leadership. This is the one, the leader fundamentally differs from all the other traditional leadership styles by focusing on growth and well-being of those that he's leading. He has a direction for them. He has a path that he wants them to follow. He is going to walk that path in front of them, but he may do that at his own peril. And so when we're thinking about authoritative, what we're talking about is a high control, low involvement leader. This is the guy who basically flies in, tell me what's going on. Okay, here's what you're going to do this, you're going to do that. You're not going to do that in school anymore. And doesn't really accept any type of, there's no discussion there. This is a very, if it's not careful, an authoritative leader can become an authoritarian, an autocratic leader very quickly. Pros, decisions get made quickly. There is clear direction. There may not always be a why behind it, but the what is really clear. The cons, you're not really inspiring those that you're leading to develop to their full potential. Most of the time, the authoritative leader is leading from a position of fear and not trust. So it limits the openness of communication and can erode trust and intimacy. So basically, CTI goes out the window. Now, if you took that exam, you took that quiz, and you came up authoritative leader, that is not necessarily a bad thing, but you do need to be careful. There are some dangers there that you need to be thinking about. You need to be thinking about the kind of example that you're setting for your kids and the kind of what you're inspiring your wife to respond to. Then the democratic leadership. Everything's a family discussion, from where we go on vacation to what we eat to whose turn it is to take the trash out. There's a lot of communication in democratic leadership. Democratic leaders build a lot of trust, but they also don't typically make decisions. And so basically, leadership in true democratic leadership fashion is by committee. It's hard to bring up your children in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. It's hard to build intimacy with your wife because she sees you as someone who's providing and caring for her and leading her in a direction. It's hard to build that level of intimacy if you're expecting input on everything that you do. And I got to tell you, the democratic leadership is one that I sometimes default into. I want to be sure I'm making the best decision. Information to me is key. I want to know, what does everybody think? What is everybody feeling? How is everybody feeling about the last decision we make? I've got to resist that pull. But like the democratic leadership, there's the laissez-faire leadership, which basically is the let it be what it will be. This is offering freedom with minimal interference. It encourages independence. But that lack of guidance is going to tear down, again, trust and intimacy. The transformational leader is inspiring change. He enhances communication, fosters personal growth, but sometimes his expectations are not very, very realistic. I've known lots of people who've withered in their life under the expectations of people who wanted them to transform, and very quickly. The transactional leader is a very clear structure. Rewards and consequences are how he thinks. This is probably the style of leadership that most men tend to gravitate toward, is the transactional leadership. You do this, you get a reward. You do that, you get punished. But often we're negligent when we do that to the real needs. We don't stop and ask, why is the person doing this? Remember what I said? They're real clear on the what, but not always clear on the why. That's transactional leadership. Servant leadership puts the needs of the family first. It deepens trust. It strengthens intimacy. I tell you, I say this all the time to young men when they talk to me about the relationship between them and their wives physically, that one of the things that the biggest complaint I've ever heard as a preacher from young men when they're wanting to talk to me about marriage is we don't have enough sex. And I tell them this, I said, this is not why you do this, but if you want to increase physical intimacy, you need to help her trust you. Nothing increases physical intimacy with your wife like trust. Nothing increases sexual intimacy like safety and feeling safe. That's what servant leadership does. Now, you don't do this to increase sexual intimacy. It's a benefit, but it is ultimately, this is how God leads us. This is the leadership God depicts in the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. There's God's why. For the glory of my name, because I want these people to share in the glory of my name, I'm going to lead them in paths of righteousness. I'm going to lead them to green pastures. I'm going to lead them beside quiet waters. I'm going to restore their soul. Why? Because it shows them how good I am. It shows the world how good I am. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. They prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies, and you have anointed my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and loving kindness will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That's straight up servant leadership. Why? I know what the why is. God's doing that for his glory. I know what the why is. I want my son to see the glory of God. Why? Because God is glorious. I want my wife to see the glory of God in me. Why? Because God is glorious. But the con is, sometimes I also have to be the authority. Sometimes it's not enough just to say, I'm going to do everything I can in your best interest, for your best interest. Sometimes I've got to be the authority. And oftentimes servant leaders don't recognize that. So what are we saying? Ultimately, what we're saying is we really want to be effective leaders in our families. If we really want to model what it means to be a godly leader to our wife and to our children, to really level up and to show in us exactly what we want them to be, then we've got to know why. And we're not clear on that. And we're not clear on those principles of leadership that we talked about, what the effect of our leadership is going to be. If we're not building communication, trust, and intimacy, then we're not going to have the vision that they need to begin with. But before we can ever give them vision, I need to give them an example of what I want them to be, and I need to know why it is that I want them to be that. Look, I know this was a little bit of a shorter episode. I intended it to be because this is a very compact question, but I really want you to take a look at those leadership questions, that leadership quiz. If you're not part of the challenge, you can join in. I will send you the past week emails so that you can do that. And also the journal that we're building, that I need to get the third week journal out, but the journal that we're building each week on how we're doing with these things, because our goal is to improve as husbands, fathers, and leaders. We want to increase intimacy with our wives at all the levels, the spiritual, intellectual, emotional, and sexual. We want to increase communication and trust in our family, because ultimately that lets us level up to the people that we know that we need to be. So be sure to check out the description for the books and the links to all the things that we've been talking about on this episode. And until I see you on that bonus episode on Tuesday, How Do I Save My Marriage? Just remember, have a good day, God bless, and man up.
Dismissed!